In the summer of 1966, Chicago awoke to a nightmare. 8 young nurses murdered in their own home, and a city paralyzed with fear. The killer, a drifter with a tattoo that read, "Born to Raise Hell." This is the story of Richard Speck.
What you are about to hear is believed to be real, based on witness accounts, testimonies, and public record. This is terrifying and true.
July 14th, 1966. A quiet neighborhood on Chicago's South Side becomes the setting for one of the most brutal mass murders in American history. 8 young women bound and slaughtered in their own home. One survivor escapes to raise the alarm. The man responsible, Richard Speck, a drifter whose name would soon be etched into infamy. Tonight, we revisit the night Chicago was held hostage by terror and the chilling legacy of the man who called himself Born to Raise Hell. Make sure you're subscribed. We'll start this story after this. It was just past dawn on July 14th, 1966. A scream pierced the humid Chicago air as 23-year-old Corazon Amurao climbed out onto a second-floor ledge of a brick townhouse, trembling and desperate for help. Inside, the scene was beyond horrifying. The bodies of 8 young nurses lay strewn throughout the house, evidence of a night of unimaginable terror. Neighbors, awakened by Amurao's cries, stood aghast on the sidewalk as police arrived to confront what one newspaper would call the crime scene of the century. In a single night, an ex-convict drifter named Richard Speck had tortured, raped, and methodically murdered 8 student nurses in their own residence on Chicago's South Side, a crime so brutal and senseless that it shocked the world and left a city paralyzed with fear. This is the story of that night of horror and the twisted life and dark psychology of the man responsible, from his troubled beginnings to the chilling prison confession that would come to light decades later. We will journey through Richard Speck's life and crimes in vivid detail, tracing his path from a turbulent childhood to the bloody events of July 1966, the frantic manhunt that followed, and the dramatic trial that captivated a nation, and the disturbing legacy that endures to this day. A story that shines a light on how an ordinary summer night turned into a nightmare, and how one man's evil left an indelible mark on American history. Richard Benjamin Speck entered the world on December 6, 1941, just one day before the Pearl Harbor attack, and he later quipped with grim humor that, quote, "The day I was born, all hell broke loose the next day." It was an eerie foreshadowing of the chaos he himself would one day unleash. Speck was born in Kirkwood, Illinois, the 7th of 8 children in a struggling lower-income family. His early childhood was marred by instability and loss. When Richard was only 6 years old, his father, whom he adored, died of a heart attack, leaving his devout, teetotaler mother a young widow. 3 years later, his mother remarried, and Richard acquired a stepfather, Carl Lindbergh, whose influence would prove toxic. Lindbergh was a hard-drinking ex-con with a 25-year trail of arrests for crimes like forgery and drunk driving. He moved the family to rural Texas in 1950, transplanting young Richard from the Midwest to the hard-scrabble outskirts of Dallas. Speck's new home life in Texas was anything but happy. He hated his stepfather, who was often absent and abusive when present. The family shuffled from one poor Dallas neighborhood to another, 10 different addresses in a dozen years, never once finding stability. A shy boy with poor eyesight, Richard refused to wear the glasses he needed and struggled in school, repeating 8th grade and developing a deep-seated fear of being stared at. Fellow students remember him as nearly mute in class, a boy who shrank from attention. But outside the classroom, a very different Richard Speck emerged. By age 12, he had begun sneaking drinks of alcohol, and by 15, he was getting drunk almost every day. The quiet boy had a rebellious, self-destructive streak that was rapidly coming to the fore. Petty crime followed closely on the heels of Speck's teenage drinking. He was first arrested at 13 for trespassing, the start of a juvenile criminal record that would expand to dozens of arrests over the next several years. Fighting, public intoxication, minor thefts, Richard was in constant trouble. His home life deteriorated further as Lindbergh's drinking and temper grew worse. By the time Speck dropped out of high school at 16, he was already well acquainted with police stations and courtrooms. In November of 1961, at the Texas State Fair, 20-year-old Richard met a 15-year-old girl named Shirley Malone. Despite the age difference, a whirlwind romance ensued. Within weeks, Shirley was pregnant, and Richard did what seemed the honorable thing. He married her in January of 1962. For a moment, it looked as if domestic life might calm his demons. The newlyweds moved in with Richard's older sister in Dallas, and that summer, Shirley gave birth to a daughter, Robbie Lynn Speck. But Speck's attempts at normal family life crumbled almost as quickly as they began. Unable to stay out of trouble, he was jailed for a 22-day stint that July for disturbing the peace in a drunken brawl, missing his own daughter's birth from being behind bars. It was a pattern Shirley knew too well. Richard would be in and out of jail frequently. By 1963, at just 21, he committed his first major crime. His first major prison sentence was a 3-year term for forging a coworker's check and burglarizing a grocery store. He served 16 months in the Texas State Penitentiary before being paroled in 1965. Upon release, he lasted barely a week on the outside before being arrested yet again, this time for attacking a woman with a knife in a parking lot. Convicted of aggravated assault and parole violation, Speck was sent back to prison. Incredibly, a bureaucratic error resulted in his release after just 6 months of that sentence. Luck, it seemed, was often on Richard Speck's side in those years, allowing him to slip through the cracks in the justice system. It was during one of these early prison stints that Speck marked himself, literally, for the infamy to come. He had the words "Born to Raise Hell" tattooed in blue ink on his forearm, a bold proclamation of the chaos he carried within. Certainly his young wife had already experienced firsthand that hell-raising tendency. By January 1966, Shirley had endured enough. She filed for divorce, cutting ties with the volatile man who couldn't stay out of jail. Speck, now a 24-year-old divorced ex-convict with a tattoo flaunting his nihilism, drifted aimlessly. He bounced between menial jobs, truck driver, meat packer, often getting fired for accidents or absenteeism. He spent his nights in taverns, drinking heavily and erupting into the occasional bar fight. Behind his brooding blue eyes and sullen, quiet demeanor lurked a well of anger and resentment, especially toward women. Later, psychiatric evaluation would conclude that Speck had an obsessive-compulsive personality and harbored a Madonna prostitute complex, placing women on pedestals until they betrayed him in some way, at which point they became targets for his rage. In Speck's warped mind, women were either saintly virgins like his mother and sisters, or prostitutes deserving of punishment. This dark psychological fault line would soon split open with catastrophic consequences. In March 1966, with his life in shambles in Texas and a warrant out for yet another arrest, Richard Speck fled north, facing what would have been his 42nd arrest in Dallas. He boarded a bus for Chicago on March 9th, seeking refuge with his older sister, Martha Thornton. Chicago offered the promise of a fresh start and anonymity, a place to lie low. At first, it seemed like a stroke of good fortune. Martha's husband, Gene, was a former Navy man who suggested that Richard try working as a merchant seaman on the Great Lakes freighters. Perhaps the discipline of ship life could straighten him out. On April 25, 1966, Speck dutifully applied for a seaman's card at the Coast Guard office, completing the fingerprints and physical exam needed for union work papers. By the end of April, he landed a spot as an apprentice seaman on an ore freighter. For a moment, it appeared as if Speck might truly turn a corner. Fate, or Speck's own self-sabotaging behavior, intervened. Just days into his first voyage on the ore boat Clarence B. Randall, Speck was stricken with acute appendicitis and had to be airlifted off the ship for emergency surgery. After recuperating from his appendectomy, he returned to the Randall in May 1966 and sailed as a deckhand until mid-June. But Speck's old habits resurfaced. He fell into heavy drinking on board and clashed with an officer. On June 14th, after a drunken quarrel, he was kicked off the ship at its port of call. By June 15th, Richard Speck was once again unemployed and adrift in Chicago. Over the next weeks, Speck drifted through cheap flophouses and bars on Chicago's far south side, growing increasingly despondent and angry. He briefly left the city to visit a nurse's aide he had befriended during his hospital stay, a 28-year-old woman in Michigan who even lent him $80 out of pity. But by early July, he was back in Chicago, jobless and quickly burning through what little money he had. Each morning, he haunted the National Maritime Union hiring hall on East 100th Street, hoping to snag a berth on a ship. Each day, other seamen with more seniority were chosen over him. On July 11th, Speck's sister and brother-in-law informed him he could no longer stay at their home. His welcome had run out. Carrying his meager belongings in a couple of suitcases, Speck rented a room for $2.50, a meager $24.81 even in today's money, at a nearby boarding house, and continued his fruitless wait at the hiring hall. By Wednesday, July 13th, 1966, Richard Speck was nearing a breaking point. That afternoon, he lost out on yet another ship assignment due to an administrative mix-up. Frustrated, broke, and fueled by alcohol and seething resentment, he wandered the neighborhood around the hiring hall. The summer sun beat down as he carried his suitcases through South Deering, eventually stashing them at a gas station for the day. At 5'8" with a lanky build, the 24-year-old ex-sailor cut an unremarkable figure, dressed entirely in black and brooding under a mop of dark hair. But inside, his thoughts were anything but ordinary. He had a knife in his pocket, desperation in his heart, and no plan for what to do next. That evening, Speck did what he often did. He went to drink at a local tavern. As he downed cheap whiskey at a bar called Kay's Pilot House, he crossed paths with a 53-year-old woman named Ella Mae Hooper. Ella Mae was a regular in the local bars, and the two spent part of the evening drinking in the same watering holes. Sometime that night, Speck decided to turn his simmering anger on this unsuspecting stranger. At knife point, he forced Ella Mae back to his rented room at the Shipyard Inn. There, in a squalid little room, he raped her and stole her handgun, a small black .22 caliber pistol she had bought through a mail-order catalog. Speck left the terrified woman alive, but traumatized, taking her revolver as loot. It was around 10:20 p.m. when he walked out of the Shipyard Inn tavern, armed now with both a stolen gun and his switchblade, his mind clouded by liquor and rage. What happened next would make Ella Mae's ordeal seem, by comparison, like the lucky escape that it was. In the back of his mind, Richard Speck may have only intended to commit a routine burglary that night. Perhaps he thought to break into a home, steal some quick cash, and move on. But the line between petty criminal and mass murderer was about to be crossed. Just a block and a half from the hiring hall stood a cluster of brick townhouses that served as a dormitory for young student nurses, from the South Chicago Community Hospital. Speck knew the area from his daily Union Hall visits. Under the cover of darkness, shortly before 11 p.m. on July 13th, 1966, he made his way toward 2319 East 100th Street, one of the nurse residences. Inside that townhouse, 9 women were winding down their day, studying, chatting, sleeping, unaware that evil was heading for their doorstep. The modest townhome at 2319 East 100th Street in Chicago's Jeffrey Manor neighborhood became the scene of one of the grimmest crimes in U.S. history. On a sweltering Wednesday night, the brick building's quiet was shattered when Richard Speck broke in through the back door around 11 p.m. Speck had slipped a knife blade under a window screen and pried it open to unlatch the door. Armed with his knife and Ella May's stolen pistol, he stepped into the living room of the nurse's residence. Inside, a nightmare was about to unfold. In the living room, Speck confronted 3 young women who had been chatting there. Brandishing the gun, he forced Corazon Amurao, Merlita Gargula, and Valentina Pasión into a bedroom where 3 more of their roommates lay asleep. The sudden intrusion sent a wave of terror throughout the townhouse. Speck discovered a total of 6 women now gathered in one room, some in nightclothes, eyes wide with fear. Switching on a bedside lamp, the intruder revealed himself. A scowling man dressed in black, reeking of alcohol, with a pockmarked face and the aforementioned inciting phrase tattooed on his forearm. In a frighteningly calm voice, Speck assured the trembling nurses that he only wanted to rob them. He ordered them to empty their purses of money. In hopes of surviving, the women complied, handing over cash and valuables. In order to keep his hostages under control, Speck tore bedsheets into strips and tied up his victims, binding their wrists and ankles with expert knots that suggested his seaman's training. The nurses could only exchange terrified glances as Speck methodically secured them. He gagged some of them to muffle any screams. 6 captives now sat or lay, huddled together, in that sweltering bedroom, hearts pounding, as the armed stranger paced and rifled through their belongings. For a brief moment, the nightmare seemed to stabilize into a tense waiting game. Perhaps the burglar would just take the money and leave, as he promised. But any hope of a relatively safe outcome soon evaporated. Around midnight, the front door of the townhouse opened, and 3 more nursing students returned home, one after another. Pamela Wilkening, 20 years old, was coming off her evening shift. Suzanne Ferris, 21 years old, and Mary Ann Jordan, 20 years old, had been out on a casual double date and had just been dropped off home, unaware of the danger inside. As each of these women entered the residence, they were startled to find a strange man with a gun and a house full of bound and frightened roommates. Speck quickly seized each newcomer and tied her up as well, adding Pam, Suzanne, and Mary Ann to the group of hostages. the situation grew even more chaotic. 9 young women now fell under the control of the armed intruder. Speck's demeanor shifted once the last of the roommates was caught. The pretense of a simple robbery dropped away, revealing a far more dangerous intent. Later, investigators speculated that Speck's original plan had indeed been a burglary, but the arrival of additional witnesses pushed him into a deadly corner. He could not risk leaving anyone behind to identify him. The terrified nurses now realized they weren't dealing with a mere thief. They were hostages to a man capable of unspeakable violence. What followed was an hours-long ordeal of pure horror, as one by one, Speck began to slaughter the defenseless women. At knife point, Speck grabbed Pamela Wilkening, one of the newly arrived roommates. Pamela, a 20-year-old student, had the misfortune of attracting Speck's fury first. She may have resisted or even, as Speck later claimed, spit in his face, enraging him. Speck dragged Pam out of the main bedroom and into another room. The 8 women left behind could only imagine what was happening as they heard muffled struggles and a scream cut short. In that back room, Speck stabbed Pamela once through the heart, killing her almost instantly. In that moment, a routine burglary officially turned into a bloodbath. As Speck returned for more victims, Mary Ann Jordan and Suzanne Ferris, the 2 friends who had come home together, somehow freed themselves from their bonds and attempted to fight back or flee when they realized what was happening. They burst out of the bedroom in a desperate bid for their lives, catching Speck by surprise. What followed was a frenzy of violence. Speck set upon them with his knife, slashing and stabbing with uncontrollable ferocity. Suzanne Ferris, just 21, was stabbed 18 times, and 20-year-old Mary Ann Jordan was stabbed 5 times. Their bodies left bloody on the floor beside Pamela's. In a matter of minutes, 3 of the 9 nurses were dead. Speck's hands and arms were slick with blood, and any last shred of restraint had fallen away. Quote, "I wound up trying to kill off all the witnesses," he later admitted, coolly. Having eliminated the 2 who resisted, Speck returned to the bedroom where the remaining 6 women still lay bound and helpless. Inside that sweltering room, the captive nurses could hear their friends being butchered, one after the other, the thuds and muffled cries echoing through the walls. They huddled together in terror, some silently praying, when the bedroom door creaked open. Speck stood there with a knife in his hand and an unfathomable look in his eyes. He had crossed the point of no return. Quote, "It was at that moment that he decided to kill them all. They had all seen his face," one detective later observed of Speck's mindset. In Speck's own blunt words, quote, "All hell broke loose in that townhouse," His homicidal rage was now in full, unrelenting motion. What followed was a grim procession of death. Speck began selecting the women, one by one, yanking each from the room to meet her fate, while the others waited, bound and gagged, in absolute dread. 23-year-old Gloria Davy, 24-year-old Nina Jo Schmale, 23-year-old Valentina Pasion, 23-year-old Merlita Gargulo, and 20-year-old Patricia Matusek were led away in turn and murdered. Some were strangled with strips of bedsheet, others were stabbed or a combination of both. The unsuspecting house was turned into a slaughterhouse. Between each killing, Speck would return to the main bedroom to grab the next victim, a bloodied butcher calmly choosing the next lamb. Each time he left the room with a captive, the minutes dragged excruciatingly for those still waiting. Muffled screams or thuds would eventually signal another friend gone, and the cycle would begin anew. The killings were separated by agonizing intervals of 20 to 30 minutes, ample time for the remaining women to fully comprehend the fate that was approaching. One can only imagine the psychological torture they endured in those intervals, the prayers, the tears in the dark, the faint hope that perhaps police would burst in at any moment and save them. For Corazon Amurao, that dwindling group of doomed friends initially included her. Cora had been there from the beginning. She was the one who answered the door to Speck that night, unwittingly letting the wolf into the fold. Now, bound hand and foot on the floor amid the carnage, Cora realized with clarity that unless she did something, she would be next. Summoning every ounce of courage, Cora decided to hide in plain sight. While Speck was out of the room with another victim, Cora inched her way, still tied, towards a narrow gap beneath one of the bunk beds. Inch by inch, the 23-year-old nursing exchange student from the Philippines wriggled on her belly into the dark recess under the bed frame. There she lay, cramped and barely breathing, trying to make no sound. Blankets hanging off the bed provided a flimsy concealment. Cora's heart pounded as she listened to Richard Speck drag yet another roommate out of the room to her death. Would he notice one fewer figure when he returned? One after another, Speck dispatched the remaining nurses. He showed a particular cruelty toward Gloria Davy, the last victim, who endured the worst of his savagery. Unlike the others, Gloria was not simply stabbed or strangled immediately. Speck sexually assaulted her before killing her. Gloria's end was especially brutal. Speck strangled her with a length of cloth so tightly that when police later found her, the ligature was dug deeply into her neck, requiring significant effort to cut free. Investigators would later theorize that Speck's rage peaked with Gloria. Chillingly, a Cook County jail psychiatrist discovered that Gloria Davy was a dead ringer for Speck's ex-wife, Shirley. When presented with Gloria's photo after his arrest, Speck jumped as if he had seen a snake. The psychiatrist Dr. Marvin Ziporin believed that something about Gloria, her resemblance to the woman who had divorced him, tapped into Speck's deepest hatred. On the secret tape he made years later, Speck sneered about Gloria. Quote, "She was the one that was flirting with me. She didn't have nothing I wanted, and I killed her." It was an appalling statement of utter remorselessness toward the young woman he had violated and strangled last. By roughly 3:30 a.m. on July 14th, the rampage was over. The air inside 2319 East 100th Street was stifling and thick with the coppery smell of blood. The floors were slick. 8 women lay dead, their youthful lives brutally snuffed out in a matter of hours. In the sudden stillness, Richard Speck stood amidst the carnage and surveyed the bedroom one final time. Incredibly, he failed to notice that a 9th woman was no longer among the bodies. Whether he miscounted in his drunken haze or assumed only 8 nurses lived there, Speck was unaware that one potential witness still lived. Satisfied that no one was left alive, he wiped his knife, pocketed the small amount of money he had stolen from purses, and walked out into the night. Under the bed in the front bedroom, Corazon Amurao did not dare move or make a sound. She had heard everything: the thuds of bodies, the horrifying muffled cries of pain, the footsteps of her friends being led away one by one. Bound and gagged, she prayed that the man would not return and discover her. Minutes passed, then an hour. Finally, the only sounds were the ticking of a clock and Cora's own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Still, she waited, paralyzed with fear that he might be lurking. It was nearly 6 a.m., almost 3 hours after Speck had left, when Cora dared to emerge. Dawn light crept through the windows, illuminating a scene of utter devastation. Overturned furniture, blood-spattered walls, and the lifeless forms of her roommates. Cora somehow summoned the strength to untie herself and climb out of a window onto a narrow ledge. Then, the enormity of what had happened crashing upon her, she began screaming, "Help! Help! My friends are dead! All my friends are dead!" Her screams echoed down East 100th Street as stunned neighbors emerged from their homes. Police arrived swiftly, and what they found inside left even veteran officers shaken. Quote, "Inside, the house was in shambles. Bodies were strewn about and blood congealed in the morning heat," one report described. The first responders carefully carried out the victims, one by one, placing 8 young women in body bags and bringing them past crowds of horrified onlookers. Most of the victims were between 20 and 23 years old, students just weeks away from completing their nursing training. In the span of a few dark hours, a single depraved killer had annihilated nearly an entire class of caregivers. The crime was immediately recognized as one of the worst mass murders in American history up to that time. Chicago newspapers blared the story that very afternoon, spreading shock and panic. Doors that had long been left unlocked were bolted shut all across the city as the realization sank in. A madman was on the loose. Corazon Amurao, the lone survivor, became the critical witness to this horror. At just 23 years old, far from her home in the Philippines, she had lost 8 dear friends in one night and barely escaped with her own life. Yet, despite her trauma, Cora would prove to be incredibly composed and determined in the aftermath. She provided the police with as much detail as she could about the killer. His height, his face, and crucially, that distinctive Born to Raise Hell tattoo on his forearm. Working quickly as possible, detectives had Cora help them create a composite sketch of the suspect's face. A sketch that, by the next morning, was front-page news on every Chicago paper. The biggest manhunt in Chicago's history was officially underway. Chicago in July of 1966 was a city under siege, not by an invading army, but by the palpable fear of a killer roaming free. In the days following the nurse murders, anxiety gripped the metropolis. Quote, "When Richard Speck was on the loose in 1966, people were afraid to go outside," recalled one account. Residents double-locked their doors and peered over their shoulders. The newspapers christened the unknown assailant the madman, the monster, or simply the killer. For 2 days, Richard Speck walked among this terrified public as an anonymous fugitive, while hundreds of police officers worked around the clock to track him down. The breakthrough came from diligent police legwork and a bit of luck. On the morning of July 14th, mere hours after the massacre, Detective Eddie Wielasinski canvassed the neighborhood for any clues. At a gas station 6 blocks from the murder scene, the attendant, Dennis Ryan, mentioned an unusual encounter from the previous night. A disheveled man had come in with a couple of suitcases, asking if he could leave them overnight. The man had muttered something about being a seaman. This piqued the detective's interest. The nurse's townhouse was only about 150 feet from the maritime hiring hall, after all. Following this lead, Wielasinski went to the NMU hiring hall across from the murder site. There, union employees immediately recognized the police composite sketch. It looked just like a seaman who had been lingering around for work. They rummaged through the wastebasket and found a crumpled registration slip with the name Richard Franklin Speck written on it. Speck's identity was now known. The dragnet tightened as investigators pulled his fingerprints from Coast Guard records and began matching them against prints lifted from the crime scene. While police were zeroing in on his identity, Richard Speck was busy trying to disappear. After leaving the massacre scene, He had retrieved his suitcases and faded into Chicago's vast Skid Row. He checked into the Star Hotel under an alias in the seedy West Madison Street district. The Star was the kind of flophouse where society's lost souls congregated, a filthy, dilapidated warren crawling with drunks and drifters. One detective described it as, quote, truly revolting. You'd walk through human waste just to reach the rooms. Here, amidst the vomit-stained corridors and flickering neon of West Madison, Speck believed he could lay low. In this boulevard of forgotten men, he was just another anonymous drifter. He spent July 15th on the Star's fire escape, drinking cheap wine with two transient men, one of whom was named Claude Lunsford. Speck likely saw the newspapers that day, his own eyes staring back from crude sketches on front pages. But he said nothing to his drinking buddies of his infamy. Lunsford later recalled noticing Speck's eerie calm and that prominent tattoo, but it wasn't until he too saw the composite sketch in the paper that he realized who his friend at the hotel really was. On the evening of July 15th, Lunsford actually phoned the police to report that Speck, the murder suspect all over the news, was right there at the Star Hotel. That call went unanswered due to a miscommunication at police dispatch. Speck remained at large, oblivious to how close he'd come to capture. By July 16th, the pressure on law enforcement was enormous. Luckily, the forensic work paid off. Speck's fingerprints from the crime scene, left on a door and other surfaces, were manually matched to those on file from his naval application. Police Superintendent Orlando Wilson held a press conference to announce Richard Speck as the prime suspect in the massacre, releasing his photograph to the public. This news was broadcast on radio, television, and in papers worldwide. The monster now had a face and a name. Speck's days of hiding under a fake identity were over. Reading the papers on July 16th, he saw himself unmasked as the wanted man. Panicked and with nowhere left to run, Speck decided to take what he thought was the only escape route left: suicide. Alone in his cheap hotel room, stewing in alcohol and despair, he picked up a broken wine bottle and slashed his left wrist and inner elbow, attempting to end his life in a gory mess of blood. But even in this, Richard Speck's luck played a cruel trick. After a few moments of bleeding, he apparently lost his nerve and staggered into the hotel hallway, seeking help. Or perhaps an employee simply heard his cries. Around midnight, an ambulance was called to the Star Hotel for a bleeding man with self-inflicted wounds. Unconscious and drenched in blood, Speck was rushed to Cook County Hospital in the early minutes of July 17, 1966. At the hospital, the hand of fate intervened decisively. A young surgical resident, Dr. Leroy Smith, had read the newspapers describing the wanted killer and his identifying tattoo. When Dr. Smith was summoned to attend to an attempted suicide case arriving in the emergency room, something clicked in his mind. As he began treating the pale, bleeding man on the gurney, he noticed, under the smeared blood, faint blue letters on the patient's forearm. Born to raise hell. Smith's pulse quickened. Quote, I asked him what his name was, and he told me his name was Speck, the doctor later recounted. In that instant, the monster was unmasked. Dr. Smith stepped back and notified security and the police. The mass murderer that all of Chicago was hunting was lying right there on the operating table. Police rushed in and finally placed Richard Speck under arrest in the early hours of July 17, 1966. He was so physically weak from blood loss that he needed surgery to repair a severed artery. Officers stood guard in the operating room, ensuring the man who had so narrowly cheated justice before would not slip away this time. Outside the hospital, a crowd gathered despite the late hour, eager for confirmation that the nightmare was over. When word spread that Speck had been caught, a collective sigh of relief was felt in Chicago and across the nation. The city could sleep a little easier knowing the madman of 100th Street was behind bars, heavily sedated and handcuffed to a hospital bed. But for the families of the victims, and for the one lone survivor, Corazon Amurao, the ordeal was not over. They now faced the emotional turmoil of trials and the harsh glare of public attention. Speck's capture raised immediate questions. Could such an explosive, violent individual possibly be sane? In the wake of the Miranda v. Arizona ruling just weeks earlier, police were exceedingly cautious. Speck was not even interrogated for weeks in order to avoid jeopardizing the case on a technicality. Miranda v. Arizona is what established what has become known as Miranda rights, law enforcement's responsibility to inform those they have arrested of their right to remain silent, of the possibility that anything they say can be used against them, and their right to an attorney. In the meantime, investigators built an ironclad case. They had fingerprints matching Speck at the crime scene. They had stolen items from earlier crimes in Speck's possession. Most importantly, though, they had an eyewitness who had looked the killer in the eyes. Cora Amurao's brave testimony would become the linchpin to ensuring Richard Speck faced justice. And so, less than 10 months after that awful July night, the stage was set in a Peoria courthouse for one of the most dramatic criminal trials of the 1960s. The trial of Richard Speck opened in early April 1967, and it unfolded like a gripping courtroom drama that held the entire country in thrall. Due to massive pre-trial publicity and public anger in Chicago, the venue had been moved to Peoria, Illinois, about 160 miles away. There, in the Peoria County Courthouse, 25-year-old Speck faced murder charges for the 8 nurses. He appeared in court clean-shaven, wearing horn-rimmed glasses and a suit, a far cry from the drunken predator of the year before. Yet the veneer of normalcy did nothing to mitigate the atmosphere of dread and fascination in the courtroom. A gag order had been imposed on press coverage, but word still trickled out about each day's dramatic proceedings. On the prosecution side were an avalanche of evidence and one star witness whose testimony would prove unforgettable. Before the trial, the defense had little to work with beyond questions of Speck's sanity and memory. A panel of doctors had examined him and found him competent to stand trial, and they rejected any insanity defense, concluding he understood the nature of his heinous acts. Speck himself claimed to have no recollection of the killings, a convenient blank spot he maintained since arrest. In private, while hospitalized after capture, he had actually confessed to Dr. Leroy Smith, blurting out, quote, "I'm the one who killed those nurses," while sedated. But that hospital bed confession was not admissible in court. Thus, when Speck's trial began on April 3, 1967, he pleaded not guilty and sat impassively as prosecutors presented the harrowing narrative of the massacre. On April 5th, Corazon Amurao took the stand, and a hush fell over the courtroom. Everyone knew that this poised young woman had lived through hell and come to speak on behalf of the dead. There had been doubts about asking Cora to relive that trauma in open court. Would she be too fragile, too frightened? Those doubts vanished as soon as she began to speak. In clear, precise detail, Corazon recounted the nightmare of July 13th and 14th, the sudden break-in, the tying up, the terror as her friends were led away, one by one. The courtroom sat riveted, some jurors in tears, as Cora described hiding under the bed and hearing the muffled screams of her roommates being murdered. Then came the moment of identification, a scene as dramatic as any Hollywood script. When asked if she saw the man who committed these crimes, Cora did not stay seated and simply point. She left the witness stand and walked directly up to the defense table, stopping just inches from Richard Speck and extending her arm to point at his face. "This is the man," she declared firmly. Her voice did not waver. Speck stared straight ahead, emotionless, as the woman he had failed to kill sealed his fate. Evidence against Speck was indeed damning, as the Chicago History Museum later put it. Beyond Cora's eyewitness testimony, fingerprints found on the doorframe of the nurse's townhouse matched those of Speck's perfectly. Stolen items from the townhome were also linked directly to him. The Born to Raise Hell tattoo had been the crucial clue leading to his capture. The defense, led by public defender Gerald Getty, could do little but try to spare Speck the death penalty. They subtly emphasized Speck's intoxication, hinting he had been in a drunken blackout. At one point, Getty even floated a story that Speck's suicidal gesture after the crime indicated remorse or mental breakdown. Speck himself would later scoff that this was propaganda that Getty used in an attempt to garner jury sympathy. But the jury was simply unmoved. Trial lasted only 12 days, and after just 49 minutes of deliberation, on April 15, 1967, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty on all 8 counts of murder. As the verdict was read, Speck reportedly showed no emotion, his face a mask. The families of the victims, who had endured every day of testimony about their daughter's last moments, quietly rejoiced at the swift justice. The jury recommended the death penalty, and Judge Herbert Passion concurred, formally sentencing Richard Speck to die in the electric chair. In Illinois at that time, executions were by electrocution at Stateville Penitentiary, and Speck was scheduled to meet that very fate in January 1968. For the press, the trial confirmed Speck's place in criminal infamy. They often referred to him now as a mass murderer, a term that, as historians note, was not commonly used in the 1960s. The specter of 8 innocent women slaughtered at once had introduced Americans to a new kind of horror, and Richard Speck became one of the first widely recognized mass murderers of the modern era. In the aftermath of the trial, the public's hunger for understanding this atrocity remained. A Cook County jail psychiatrist, Dr. Marvin Ziporin, who had interviewed Speck extensively before the trial, controversially published a book about Speck soon after the verdict. Ziporin painted Speck as a deeply disturbed man with a severe personality disorder and brain damage from old injuries, and he echoed the observation of Speck's Madonna horror complex regarding women. But none of these analyses swayed the court or the public. Insane or not, brain damaged or not, Richard Speck was going to pay with his life. Or so it seemed. Just as Speck's execution date approached, legal fate intervened once again on his behalf. In June 1972, the United States Supreme Court issued its decision in Furman v. Georgia, which effectively struck down existing death penalty statutes nationwide. Speck's death sentence was automatically vacated. That same year, in November 1972, he was resentenced by an Illinois court to an astounding 400 to 1,200 years in prison, essentially a symbolic way of ensuring he would never walk free. This massive sentence was later formally reduced to a still mind-boggling 100 to 300 years on paper. In practical terms, Richard Speck's punishment became life in prison, with no realistic hope of release. Yet, to the dismay of the victims' families, even the notion of no release proved fraught. Starting in the mid-1970s, Speck technically became eligible for periodic parole hearings, a quirk of Illinois sentencing laws that did not anticipate 1,200-year terms. Only a decade after the murders, Speck had his first parole hearing in 1976, which stunned the families of his victims. Quote, "When they commuted the death penalty, I thought it meant life in prison, said John Schmale, brother of victim Nina Schmale. I had no idea that despite the fact he murdered 8 nurses, he was up for parole within 7 years. It was indeed a cruel ordeal. Each time Speck came up for parole, and he did so 7 times in total, the bereaved families had to relive the nightmare, writing letters and often appearing in person to urge the parole board to keep this killer behind bars. Every one of Speck's parole petitions was denied, but not before reopening old wounds. As the years wore on, many of the victims' parents passed away, some not living long enough to see the final closure of Speck's saga. Quote, "Even in jail, it seems Richard Speck had found a way to kill," one commentator grimly noted, referring to how stress and grief wore down those left behind. Through it all, Speck remained largely silent publicly. He granted no interviews in the decade after the trial, except one brief conversation with a Chicago Tribune columnist in 1978. In that interview, Speck, for the first time, admitted, perhaps trying to shift blame, that he had been high on drugs and alcohol the night of the murders, and he even floated a sensational claim that he had an accomplice who helped him and whom he had later killed in fear of being betrayed. This claim of a mystery accomplice was met with skepticism. No evidence of any second perpetrator has ever surfaced. It seemed to be yet another one of Speck's manipulations, an attention-seeking ploy from behind bars. Officially, Richard Speck bore sole responsibility for the crime, and that is how history remembers it. With his appeals exhausted and parole continually denied, Richard Speck settled in to the oblivion of life in prison. But as we would come to know, even behind bars, his capacity for shocking the public was not yet over. Richard Speck's new home was Stateville Correctional Center, a maximum security prison in Illinois where he was sent to serve his staggeringly long sentence. Initially, Speck was treated as the infamous criminal he was, kept in isolation for his own safety and the prison's security. In those early years, he was a slight, brooding figure in a cell block full of hardened convicts. A guard later recalled that Speck was, quote, weak-minded and easily influenced. In other words, he wasn't a predatory alpha behind bars. He was malleable, someone who might adapt to survive. Over time, that's exactly what Richard Speck did. He adapted to prison in ways that would defy society's expectations, indulging in a life of leisure and vice that few would have imagined possible for an 8-time murderer locked away for centuries. In the 1970s and 80s, Illinois' prison system became notoriously overcrowded and corrupt. At Stateville, 2 inmates were often crammed into cells meant for 1, and the guard-to-prisoner ratio was terribly low. This environment allowed enterprising inmates to obtain all manner of contraband, usually with the aid of bribed or coerced guards. Speck took full advantage. Once he was moved into the general population, he found ways to gain a measure of freedom and comfort. He secured prison jobs as a painter and sewing machine repairman, roles that let him roam around the facility more than most. He learned to brew homemade alcohol, often referred to as Pruno, and became a supplier of it to other inmates, which earned him favors and a form of power in the inmate hierarchy. In effect, Speck, the lowly, weak inmate, ingratiated himself and became a fixture in Stateville's underground economy. But the most bizarre transformation was physical. Sometime in the early 1980s, fellow prisoners noticed that Speck was developing female-like breasts. Rumors ran wild. Was he intentionally taking hormone pills smuggled into the prison? Had he effectively transitioned to serve as another inmate's girlfriend? Photographs from later years show Speck with noticeable breasts and often wearing women's underwear. It appeared he had indeed been ingesting estrogen or other hormones in order to feminize his appearance. Whether this was done voluntary in order to gain protection or favor from more dominant inmates, or coerced by said dominant inmates, remains unclear. What was clear is that Speck had become a far cry from the tattooed macho drifter who had terrorized nurses in 1966. Inside the twisted social ecosystem of Stateville, Richard Speck was thriving in his own depraved way, getting high, having sex, and flouting the system's rules right underneath the noses of prison officials. For years, these excesses remained hidden from the public, but that changed in May of 1996. Five years after Speck's death, a shocking video surfaced and exploded on television screens across America. Investigative journalist Bill Curtis obtained an 8mm videotape that had been recorded inside Stateville back in 1988. The tape, grainy, raw, and almost unbelievable, showed Richard Speck and two inmate companions partying in a prison cell like it was a frat house. On this contraband video, Speck appeared with bleach blonde hair, wearing silky women's panties, his shirt pulled up to reveal feminine breasts. He was snorting what looked like lines of cocaine, chugging whiskey, and rolling joints of marijuana. At one point, he produced a thick roll of $100 bills and casually counted them on camera, boasting of his illicit riches. In perhaps the most disturbing segment, Speck engaged in explicit sexual acts with his fellow inmate, who was referred to as his lover on camera. Seeming utterly unconcerned about being filmed, the sheer brazenness of it all was mind-numbing. Here was a convicted mass murderer, supposedly serving hard time in a maximum security prison, yet on video, he appeared to be having the time of his life behind bars. And then, in between these X-rated and drug-fueled exploits, Richard Speck began to talk. The tape unexpectedly became a confessional. In a kind of interview segment, apparently one inmate quizzing Speck on camera, Speck nonchalantly admitted to the nurse murders. The exchange went like this. "What are you in for?" the off-screen inmate asked. "8 murders," Speck answered. "Did you really do it?" inquired the inmate. "Yeah, sure I did," Speck said casually. "Why?" "It just wasn't their night," Speck said, with a stomach-churning smirk. The man who had claimed amnesia during his trial now coolly detailed his crime. He explained he used a knife instead of his gun because, quote, "guns make too much noise. The knife was quiet." He described how it began as a burglary until, quote, "all hell broke loose." He even educated his listeners on the mechanics of murder. Quote, "strangling somebody isn't like TV. You gotta go at it for 3 minutes. It takes a lot of strength." Perhaps most chilling of all was Speck's complete lack of remorse. On the tape, an inmate asked, "How do you feel after killing all those women?" Speck replied, with a shrug, "Like I always felt. I had no feelings. If you're asking if I felt sorry, no." In that one tape, Speck managed to horrify the nation all over again, not with new crimes, but with the evidence that he had never been punished as harshly as everyone had assumed. The video's public release in 1996 caused a national scandal. People could not fathom how a man guilty of such atrocities could be effectively enjoying a hedonistic romp in prison, as one reporter put it. Lawmakers in Illinois were outraged. Hearings were convened in the state legislature, even as the videotaped excerpts were broadcast on the news. Quote, "It's an indictment of our prison system, how we really lost control," said one prison reform advocate upon seeing the Speck tape. Indeed, the tape forced an ugly reckoning. Guards were complicit in smuggling contraband, drugs, money, cameras, etc., to inmates, and Stateville was revealed to be dangerously lax. For the families of Speck's victims, the tape was like ripping open an old wound. They had lived with the fact that Speck escaped the electric chair, but they took some solace in thinking he was languishing miserably in a cell. Now they saw him laughing, partying, and gloating about the murders of their loved ones. The outrage was enough that many cited the Speck tape as justification to bring back the death penalty for heinous criminals. Illinois had reinstated capital punishment in 1974 after the Furman pause, but the broader debate on the death penalty's merits was reinvigorated by this scandal. In the end, however, Richard Speck himself never faced any direct consequences from the tape. He had died quietly a few years before it emerged. On December 5th, 1991, the eve of his 50th birthday, Speck collapsed in his prison cell after complaining of chest pains. He was rushed to a hospital in Joliet, and doctors worked furiously for over 4 hours to save his life, oddly determined to revive a man who had shown no mercy to others. But Speck was beyond saving. He died of what was officially recorded as a heart attack at age 49. In a final footnote befitting his ignominy, none of Speck's family came forward to claim the body. His remains were cremated, and his ashes were quietly scattered at an undisclosed location, effectively thrown to the wind, just as he had once said he didn't give a damn what became of him after death. Richard Speck, the man who declared himself the devil and boasted, quote, "If they knew how much fun I was having, they'd turn me loose," exited the world as anonymously as he had entered it. Yet the shadow he cast on his victims' families, on the city of Chicago, and on American society would not disperse so easily. 'Cause Even now, nearly 6 decades later, the name Richard Speck sends a shiver through those old enough to remember the summer of 1966. His crimes stand as a gruesome benchmark in the history of American violence, often referred to as the Chicago Nurse Murders, or simply the Chicago Massacre. At the time, it captured the fear and imagination of a generation. Ordinary people could not fathom how one man could be so cruel as to bind and systematically kill 8 young women who had dedicated their lives to healing others. The gruesomeness of Speck's rampage forced Americans to realize that the most horrific crimes were not limited to gangsters or warfare. They could erupt without warning in an ordinary urban townhouse. In many ways, the Speck case marked a turning point. While in hindsight, the 1960s in America is seen as a nostalgic era, in reality, it had been roiled by political assassinations, civil unrest, domestic terrorism, and war abroad. But Richard Speck brought horror straight into the domestic sphere, into a home where people should have been safe. As one Chicago paper put it, after Speck, people started locking their doors at night. The cultural impact was profound. The media coverage of the Speck case was unprecedented in scale for a crime of this kind. It was one of the first times the term mass murderer was applied to a killer of strangers. Previously, that phrase conjured images of Prohibition-era gangsters or wartime atrocities. Speck's one-man massacre changed that, and sadly, the term would find many more applications in the decades to follow. Some criminologists and historians consider the Speck murders, along with a certain Texas Tower sniper attack that occurred just 2 weeks later in 1966, as the beginning of a modern era of mass murders in America. It jolted law enforcement into new approaches for manhunts and for understanding the psychology of spree killers. Speck was not a serial killer with a pattern across months or years. He was something arguably more frightening at the time. An unpredictable man whose anger exploded in one cataclysmic event. The victims of Richard Speck were not forgotten. Their names, Gloria Davy, Patricia Matusik, Nina Jo Schmale, Pamela Wilkening, Suzanne Ferris, Mary Ann Jordan, Merlita Gargulo, and Valentina Passion, became etched in Chicago's collective memory. All were in their early 20s, on the cusp of graduating and launching careers in nursing. Gargulo and Passion had traveled from the Philippines full of hope to train in America, only to meet a tragic end far from home. After the murders, the 2 Filipina nurses' bodies were returned to their homeland, following a solemn memorial mass in Chicago. The loss of these bright, caring women resonated with the public. It added a deeper layer of heartbreak that those who dedicated themselves to saving lives had their own lives taken in such a brutal manner. Hospitals and nursing programs in the aftermath took a hard look at security. The nurses' townhouse itself, unguarded and accessible, became a cautionary example of vulnerability. Indeed, the South Chicago Community Hospital reportedly began instituting tighter controls on dormitories and escorting staff. A small but meaningful change spurred by the tragedy. In Chicago, the site of the murders on East 100th Street bore a dark legacy. For years, the townhouse remained a painful landmark of evil. It has since been demolished, the lot either left empty or rebuilt, but the memory lingers in the community. Each year, on the July 13th anniversary, some Chicagoans still recall the horror that took place there. The city's newspapers and historical societies periodically recount the story, ensuring new generations learn about the grim anniversary and the lessons it holds. Chicago wasn't alone in never being the same after Richard Speck. The criminal justice system would also never be the same. Illinois, which had commuted Speck's death sentence and essentially allowed him to live out his natural life, later went through cycles of abolishing and reinstating the death penalty. In debates, prosecutors and politicians would invoke names like Speck's, arguing that some crimes were so heinous that execution was the only just punishment. When the Speck tapes surfaced in 1996, as mentioned, they added fuel to those arguments. Public sentiment swung toward the view that society had failed by letting Speck live and even thrive in prison. The scandal forced reforms in Illinois prisons. There was a crackdown, at least temporarily, on contraband and corruption. Some guards faced investigation for how Speck could obtain a video camera, let alone drugs, so freely. The Illinois legislature even held official hearings specifically on the Speck tape incident. While one might cynically note these efforts came years too late, after Speck was already dead, they nonetheless show his actions continued to spark change long after the fact. In the arena of popular culture, the Speck murders have been retold countless times, reflecting an enduring morbid fascination. Films, TV movies, and episodes of true crime series have dramatized the story, often focusing on the tension of that night and the miracle of Corazon Amurao's survival. True crime authors have pored over Speck's psyche in books, examining how an unremarkable loser became a figure of nightmares. Speck's infamy even found its way into music and literature as a symbol of pure evil and the banality of it. Yet, unlike certain serial killers who spawn cult followings or copycats, Speck remains more reviled than mythologized. A boogeyman that evokes revulsion rather than dark charisma. Perhaps it's because there is so little ambiguity or mystery in his crimes. It was brutality, plain and simple, visited upon innocence. For the families of those 8 nurses, Richard Speck's death in 1991 brought a measure of closure. Quote, "When he died, for me anyway, there was closure," said John Schmale, who lost his sister Nina Jo to Speck's knife. Quote, "Finally, it's over. No more parole hearings. He doesn't have my sister's picture in his cell anymore. Finally, it's over. Schmale's words underscore the painfully long shadow Speck cast. It stretched over 25 years, through the trial, the appeals, the parole hearings, and the posthumous release of the tapes. Only with Speck's cremation and scattering did the families feel that chapter could finally fully close. Even so, the grief never vanished. The families carry the memory of their daughters and sisters, forever young and frozen in 1966, robbed of promising futures. Memorial scholarships and plaques were established in honor of the slain nurses at their nursing school, preserving their legacy as caregivers whose lives were cut short. In the final analysis, Richard Speck's story is a cautionary tale on multiple levels. It's a study in how a toxic mix of abuse, alcoholism, and criminal impunity can incubate a ticking time bomb of violence. It highlights the fragility of public safety, how one random encounter with evil can shatter so many lives. It raises uncomfortable questions about the purpose of incarceration. Was justice truly served in his case, or did the system fail to uphold any meaningful punishment after the initial verdict? And it forces a contemplation on evil itself. Was Speck born a monster or a product of environment? That debate may never be resolved. What is certain is that one hot summer night in 1966, a perfect storm of Speck's personal demons unleashed unspeakable horror on innocent women. Today, the tale of Richard Speck is recounted not to glorify the killer, but to remember the victims and to attempt to glean lessons. It urges vigilance in protecting the vulnerable, compassion for survivors like Cora, who displayed unimaginable bravery, and the importance of a justice system that balances punishment with prevention. Speck once infamously said on tape, quote, "If I die, I don't give a damn if they throw me in the gutter." In the end, he got his wish. He died ignominiously, and his ashes were thrown to the winds, unmourned. But the legacy of his crimes, the reforms they spurred, the nightmares they fueled, and the resolve they hardened in law enforcement and the public, remains firmly etched in history. The story of Richard Speck stands as a dark chronicle of American crime, a reminder of how quickly a normal night can descend into terror, and how the resilience of the human spirit, exemplified by a young nurse hiding under a bed and later standing face to face with her attacker in court, standing up not only for herself, but for her slain friends, can ultimately shine a light even in the face of such darkness. Terrifying and True is narrated by Enrique Couto. It's executive produced by Rob Fields and Bobbletopia.com, and produced by Dan Wilder, with original theme music by Ray Mattis. If you have a story you think we should cover on Terrifying and True, send us an email at weeklyspooky@gmail.com. And if you want to support us for as little as $1 a month, go to weeklyspooky.com/join. Your support for as little as $1 a month keeps the show going And speaking of, I want to say an extra special thank you to our Patreon podcast boosters, folks who pay a little bit more to hear their name at the end of the show. And they are Johnny Nix, Kate and Lulu, Jessica Fuller, Mike Eschewey, Jenny Green, Amber Hansford, Karen Wiemet, Jack Kerr, and Craig Cohen. Thank you all so much, and thank you for listening. We'll see you all right here next time on Terrifying and True.